Chapter 2, The Metaphysics of Political Economy, Section 1, The Method. Now we are quite in Germany. We have now to talk metaphysics while speaking of political economy. And, in this again, we only follow the contradictions of Mr. Proudhon. Just now he compelled us to speak English, to become even passably English ourselves. Now the scene changes. Mr. Proudhon transports us to our dear native land and compels us, in spite of ourselves, to once more assume our quality of German. If the Englishman transforms men into hats, the German transforms hats into ideas. The Englishman is Ricardo, a rich banker and distinguished economist. The German is Hegel, a simple professor of philosophy at the Berlin University. Louis XV, the last absolute monarch, and who represented the decadence of French royalty, had attached to his person a physician who was, himself, the first economist of France. This physician, this economist, represented the imminent and certain triumph of the French bourgeoisie. Dr. Quesnay has made of political economy a science. He has summarized it in his famous Tableau économique. Besides the 1,001 commentaries which have appeared on this tableau, we possess one by the doctor himself. It is The Analysis of the Economic Tableau, followed by 7 important observations. Mr. Proudhon is another Dr. Quesnay, the Quesnay of the metaphysics of political economy. But metaphysics, the whole of philosophy, in fact, is summed up, according to Hegel, in the method. It will be necessary then for us to endeavor to elucidate the method of Mr. Proudhon, which is at least as obscure as the Tableau économique. For that purpose we will give 7 observations more or less important. If Dr. Proudhon is not content with our observations, well then, he must play Abbé Baudot, and give the explanation of the economico-metaphysical method himself. First observation, quote, "We will not make a history according to the order of time, but according to the succession of ideas. The economic phases or categories are in their manifestation sometimes contemporaneous, sometimes in inverse order. Economic theories have also their logical succession and their series in the comprehension. It is this order which we flatter ourselves with having discovered." End quote. Proudhon, Volume 1, page 146. Decidedly, Mr. Proudhon has wished to frighten the French by throwing in their faces some quasi-Hegelian phrases. We are then concerned with 2 men, at first with Mr. Proudhon and then with Hegel. How does Mr. Proudhon distinguish himself from other economists? And Hegel, what role does he play in the political economy of Mr. Proudhon? The economists express the relation of bourgeois production, the division of labor, credit, money, etc., as categories fixed, immutable, eternal. Mr. Proudhon, who has before him these already famed categories, would explain to us the act of formation, the generation of these categories, principles, laws, ideas, thoughts. The economists explain to us how production is carried on in the relation given, but what they do not explain is how these relations are produced, that is to say, the historical movement which has created them. Mr. Proudhon, having taken these relations as abstract principles, categories, and thoughts, has only to put order into these thoughts, which may be found ranged alphabetically at the end of any treatise on political economy. The material of the economists is the active and busy life of men. The materials of Mr. Proudhon are the dogmas of the economists. But from the moment that we cease to follow the historical movement of the relations of production, of which the categories are nothing but theoretical expression, from the moment that we see in these categories only spontaneous thoughts and ideas, independent of the real relations, we are forced to assign the movement of pure reason as the origin of these thoughts and ideas. How does pure reason, eternal, impersonal, give birth to these thoughts? How does it proceed in order to produce them? If we had the intrepidity of Mr. Proudhon in this Hegelianism, we should say, reason is distinguished in itself from itself. What does this expression mean? Impersonal reason having outside of itself neither ground upon which to stand, nor object to which it can be opposed, nor subject with which it can be composed, finds itself forced to make a somersault in posing, opposing, and composing itself. Position, opposition, composition. To speak Greek, we have the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. As to those who are not acquainted with Hegelian language, we would say to them in the sacramental formula, affirmation, negation, and negation of the negation. That is what it means to speak in this way. It is certainly not Hebrew, so as not to displease Mr. Proudhon, but it is the language of this reason, so pure, separated from the individual. Instead of the ordinary individual, with his ordinary manner of speaking and thinking, we have nothing but this ordinary manner, pure and simple, minus the individual. Is there occasion to be surprised that everything, in the final abstraction, because it is abstraction and not analysis, presents itself in the state of logical category? Is there need to be astonished that in casting down little by little all which constitutes the individuality of a house, that in making abstraction of the materials of which it is composed, of the form which distinguishes it, you would come to have nothing but a body, that in making abstraction of the limits of this body, you would very soon have nothing but an empty space, that, finally, in making abstraction of the dimensions of this space, you would finish by having nothing more than quantity, pure and simple, the logical category? In consequence of thus abstracting all the so-called accidents, animate or inanimate, men or things, we are right in saying that in the final abstraction we have as substance the logical categories. Thus the metaphysicians who imagine that in making these abstractions they make an analysis, and who in proportion as they detach more and more from certain objects imagine that they approach the point of penetrating them, these metaphysicians have in their turn the right to say that the things of this earth are embroideries of which the logical categories form the canvas. That is what distinguishes the philosopher from the Christian. The Christian has but one incarnation of the Logos, in spite of logic. The philosopher has never finished with incarnations. That all which exists, that all which lives on land and in water, may, by force of abstraction, be reduced to a logical category, that in this fashion the whole of the real world may be drowned in the world of abstractions, in the world of logical categories. Who can wonder? All that exists, all that lives on land and in water exists, lives, only by some movement. Thus the movement of history produces the social relations, the industrial movement gives us the products of industry, etc. As by the force of abstraction we have transformed everything into a logical category, so we have only to make abstraction of all distinctive character of the different movements in order to arrive at movement in the abstract, movement purely formal, at the purely logical formula of movement. If in the logical categories is found the substance of all things, it might be supposed that in the logical formula of movement would be found the absolute method, which not only explains everything, but which further implies the movement of things. It is this absolute method that Hegel speaks in these terms. Quote, "Method is absolute force, unique, supreme, infinite, which no object can resist. It is the tendency of reason to find itself, to recognize itself, in everything." End quote. Logic, Volume 3. Everything being reduced to a logical category, and every movement, every act of production to method, it naturally follows that all masses of products and of production, of objects and of movement, are reduced to an applied metaphysic. What Hegel has done for religion, right, etc., Mr. Proudhon seeks to do for political economy. What then is this absolute method, the abstraction of movement? What is the abstraction of movement? Movement in the abstract. What is movement in the abstract? The purely logical formula of movement, or the movement of pure reason. In what does the movement of pure reason consist? To pose, oppose, and compose itself, to be formulated as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Or, better still, to affirm itself, to deny itself, and to deny its negation. How does reason act in order to affirm itself? To place itself in a given category? That is the affair of reason itself and its apologists. But once it has placed itself in thesis, this thought, opposed to itself, doubles itself into two contradictory thoughts, the positive and the negative, the yes and no. The struggle of these two antagonistic elements, comprised in the antithesis, constitutes the dialectic movement. the yes becoming no, the no becoming yes, the yes becoming at once yes and no, the no becoming at once no and yes, the contraries balance themselves, neutralize themselves, paralyze themselves. The fusion of these two contradictory thoughts constitutes a new thought, which is the synthesis of the two. This new thought unfolds itself again in two contradictory thoughts, which are confounded in their turn in a new synthesis. From this travail is born a group of thoughts. This group of thoughts follows the same dialectic movement as a simple category, and has for antithesis a contradictory group. From these two groups is born a new group of thoughts, which is the synthesis of them. As from the dialectic movement of simple categories is born the group, so from the dialectic movement of the groups is born the series, and from the dialectic movement of the series is born the whole system. Apply this method to the categories of political economy, and you will have the logic and the metaphysics of political economy, or, in other words, you will have the economic categories, known to all the world, translated into an almost unknown language, which will give them the appearance of having been freshly hatched in a head of pure reason. So much do these categories seem to engender the one the other, to enchain and entangle the one in the other by the sole labor of the dialectic movement. Let not the reader be alarmed by these metaphysics with all their scaffolding of categories, of groups, of series, and of systems. Mr. Proudhon, in spite of the great trouble he has taken to scale the height of the system of contradictions, has never been able to raise himself above the two first steps of simple thesis and antithesis, and yet he has bestridden them twice only, and out of the twice he has once tumbled backwards. Up to the present, we have only explained the dialectic of Hegel. We will see later how Mr. Proudhon has succeeded in reducing it to the most paltry proportions. Thus for Hegel, all which is past and which still passes is exactly that which passes in his own reasoning. Thus the philosophy of history is only the history of philosophy, of his own philosophy. There is no longer history according to the order of time, there is only the succession of ideas in the understanding. He thinks to construct the world by the movement of thought, while all he does is to reconstruct systematically and range under the absolute method the thoughts which are in the heads of everybody. Second observation. The economic categories are only the theoretical expressions, the abstractions of the social relations of production. Mr. Proudhon, as a true philosopher, taking the things inside out, sees in the real relations only the incarnations of these principles, of these categories, which sleep. Mr. Proudhon, the philosopher, tells us again, in the bosom of the impersonal reason of humanity. Mr. Proudhon, the economist, has clearly understood that men make cloth, linen, silk stuffs in certain determined relations of production. But what he has not understood is that these determined social relations are as much produced by men as are the cloth, the linen, etc. The social relations are intimately attached to the productive forces. In acquiring new productive forces, men change their mode of production, and in changing their mode of production, their manner of gaining a living, they change all their social relations. The windmill gives you society with the feudal lord, the steam mill society with the industrial capitalist. The same men who establish social relations conformably with their material productivity produce also the principles, the idea, the categories, conformably with their social relations. Thus these ideas, these categories, are not more eternal than the relations which they express. They are historical and transitory products. There is a continual movement of growth in the productive forces, of destruction in the social relations, of formation in ideas. There is nothing immutable but the abstraction of the movement, mors immortalis. Third observation. The relations of production of every society form a whole. Mr. Proudhon regards the economic relations as so many phases, engendering the one the other, resulting the one from the other, as the antithesis from the thesis, and realizing in their logical succession the impersonal reason of humanity. The sole inconvenience of this method is that, in approaching the examination of a single one of these phases, Mr. Proudhon cannot explain it without having recourse to the other relations of society, Relations, however, which he has not yet caused to be engendered by his dialectic movement. When afterwards, by means of pure reason, Mr. Proudhon passes to the birth of the other phases, he acts as if these were newborn infants. He forgets that they are the same age as the first. Thus, in order to arrive at the constitution of value, which is for him the basis of all economic evolutions, he cannot get away from the division of labor, competition, etc. Nevertheless, in the series, in the understanding of Mr. Proudhon, in the logical succession, these relations do not yet exist. In constructing with the categories of political economy the edifice of an ideological system, the members of the social system are dislocated. The different members of society are changed as belonging to separate societies which arrive one after the other. How, indeed, can the single logical formula of movement, of succession, of time, explain the composition of society in which all the relations coexist simultaneously and support each other? Fourth observation. Let us see now the modifications to which Mr. Proudhon subjects the dialectic of Hegel in applying it to political economy. For him, Mr. Proudhon, every economic category has two sides, the one good, the other bad. He regards the categories as the lower middle class regard the great men of history. Napoleon was a great man, he did very much good, he also did much evil. The good side and the bad side, the advantage and the inconvenience, taken together, form for Mr. Proudhon the contradiction in each economic category. The problem to solve, to conserve the good side while eliminating the bad. Slavery is an economic category as well as any other. That then has, that also, its two sides. Let us leave the bad side and speak of the beautiful side of slavery, being understood that it is only a question of direct slavery, of the slavery of the blacks in the East, in Brazil, in the southern states of North America. Direct slavery is the pivot of bourgeois industry as well as machinery, credit, etc. Without slavery you have no cotton, without cotton you cannot have modern industry. It is slavery which has given their value to the colonies. It is the colonies which have created the commerce of the world. It is the commerce of the world which is the essential condition of the great industry. Thus slavery is an economic category of the highest importance. Without slavery, North America, the most progressive country, would have been transformed into a patriarchal country. Efface North America from the map of the world, and you would have the anarchy, the complete decadence of modern commerce and civilization. Cause slavery to disappear, and you have effaced America from the map of nations. Thus slavery, because it is an economic category, has always existed in the institutions of the nations. Modern nations have known how to disguise slavery in their own lands alone. They have imposed it without disguise on the New World. What will Mr. Proudhon do to save slavery? He puts the problem, conserve the good side of this economic category, eliminate the bad. Hegel has no problems to put. He has only dialectic. Mr. Proudhon has, of the dialectic of Hegel, nothing but the language. His dialectic movement for him is the dogmatic distinction of good and evil. Let us for an instant take Mr. Proudhon himself as a category. Let us examine his good and his bad side, his advantages and his inconveniences. If he has the advantage over Hegel of putting problems which he reserves it to himself to solve for the greater good of humanity, he has the inconvenience of being stricken with sterility when it is a question of engendering by dialectical travail a new category. In order merely to put the problem of eliminating the evil side, one cuts short the dialectic movement. It is not the category which possesses and opposes itself by its contradictory nature. It is Mr. Proudhon who disturbs himself, argues with himself, strives and struggles between the two sides of the category. Taken thus in an impasse, from which it is difficult to escape by legitimate means, Mr. Proudhon performs a veritable somersault which carries him at a single bound into a new category. It is then that the series in the understanding unveils itself to his astonished eyes. He takes the first category to hand and arbitrarily attributes to it the quality of becoming a remedy to the inconveniences of the category which he wishes to purify. Thus imposts, if we are to believe Mr. Proudhon, remedy the inconveniences of monopoly, the balance of commerce, the inconveniences of imposts, landlordism, the inconveniences of credit. In thus taking successively the economic categories one by one and making one the antidote of the other, Mr. Proudhon makes of this mixture of contradictions and the antidotes to the contradictions 2 volumes of contradictions which he calls by their proper title, The System of Economic Contradictions. Fifth observation, quote, "In absolute reason all these ideas are equally simple and general. In fact, we attain to the science only by a kind of scaffolding of our ideas. But truth in itself is independent of its dialectical figures, and free from the combinations of our mind." End quote. Proudhon, Volume 2, page 97. There at a blow, by the kind of quick change of which we now know the secret, the metaphysics of political economy becomes an illusion. Never has Mr. Proudhon spoken more truly. Certainly from the movement that the development of the dialectical movement is reduced to the simple process of opposing the good to the bad, of posing problems tending to eliminate the bad, and of giving one category as antidote to the other. The categories have no more spontaneity. The idea functions no more. It has no longer any life in it. It no longer poses or decomposes itself in categories. The succession of categories has become a kind of scaffolding. The dialectic is no longer the movement of absolute reason. There is no longer any dialectic. At the most, there is only pure ethics. When Mr. Proudhon spoke of the series in the understanding of the logical succession of categories, he declared positively that he would not give history according to the order of time, that is to say, according to Mr. Proudhon, the historical succession in which the categories are manifested. All therefore passed for him in the pure ether of reason. All must be caused to flow from this ether by means of dialectic. Now that it is a question of putting this dialectic in practice, reason makes default. The dialectic of Mr. Proudhon makes a false leap to the dialectic of Hegel, and here is Mr. Proudhon compelled to say that the order in which he gives the economic categories is no longer the order in which they engendered each other. The economic evolutions are no longer the evolution of reason itself. What then is it that Mr. Proudhon gives us? Real history, that is to say, according to the understanding of Mr. Proudhon, the succession in which the categories are manifested in the order of time? No. History as it passes in the idea itself? Still less than that. Thus, neither the profane history of categories nor their sacred history. What history does he give us, in fine? The history of his own contradictions. We will see how they march and how they draw Mr. Proudhon after them. Before approaching this examination, which gives place to the sixth important observation, we have still an important observation to make. We will admit with Mr. Proudhon that real history, history according to the order of time, is the historical succession in which the ideas, the categories, the principles are manifested. Each principle has had its century in which to manifest itself. The principle of authority, for instance, had the 11th century, as the principle of individualism had the 18th century. From consequence to consequence, it was the century which appertained to the principle, and not the principle to the century. In other words, it was the principle which made history. It was not history which made the principle. When, further, in order to save the principles as well as history, we inquire why such a principle has been manifested in the 11th or in the 18th century rather than in another, we are necessarily compelled to minutely examine into what were the men of the 11th century, what were those of the 18th, what was their respective wants, their productive forces, their mode of production, the raw material of their production, in fine, what were the relations between man and man resulting from all these conditions of existence. To thoroughly examine all these questions, is it not to make real profane history of the men in each century, to represent these men at the same time as the authors and the actors of their own drama? But from the moment that you represent men as the actors and the authors of their own history, you have, by a detour, arrived at the actual point of departure, since you have abandoned the eternal principles from which you have at first set out. Mr. Proudhon has not even advanced sufficiently on the crossroads which the ideologist takes in order to gain the highway of history. Sixth observation. Let us take with Mr. Proudhon this crossroad. Let us grant that the economic relations, regarded as immutable laws, eternal principles, ideal categories, were anterior to active living men, that, further, these laws, these principles, these categories had, from the beginning of time, slept in the impersonal reason of humanity. We have already seen that with these immutable and immovable eternities, there is no history. At the most, it is only history in the idea. That is to say, history which is reflected in the dialectical movement of pure reason. Mr. Proudhon, in saying that in the dialectical movement the ideas are no longer differentiated, has annulled both the shadow of movement and the movement of the shadows, by means of which we might at most have still created a simulacrum of history. In the place of that, he inputs to history his own impotence. He takes from it all, even to the French language. Quote, "It is then not correct to say," says Mr. Proudhon the philosopher, "that something happens, something is produced. In civilization, as in the universe, everything exists, everything acts from eternity. It is thus with all social economy." End quote. Volume 2, page 102. Such is the productive force of the contradictions which function, and which make Mr. Proudhon function, that in wishing to explain history he is forced to deny it, that in wishing to explain the successive development of social relations he denies that anything can happen, and in wishing to explain production in all its phases he denies that anything can be produced. Thus for Mr. Proudhon, no more history, no more succession of ideas, and nevertheless his book still exists. And this book is precisely, according to his own expression, history according to the succession of ideas. How can we find a formula, as Mr. Proudhon is the man of formulas, by the aid of which we can leap at a single bound beyond all its contradictions? For that, he has invented a new kind of reason, which is neither absolute reason, pure and virginal, nor the common reason of men, living and active in the different centuries, but a reason quite apart, the reason of society personified, of the subject humanity, which, under the pen of Mr. Proudhon, appears sometimes also as the social genius, general reason, and in the last place as human reason. This reason dressed up under so many names is, however, every instant recognized as the individual reason of Mr. Proudhon, with his good and bad side, his antidotes and his problems. Human reason does not create the truth, hidden in the profundity of absolute eternal reason. It can only unveil it. But the truths which it has unveiled up to the present are incomplete, insufficient, and therefore contradictory. Then, the economic categories, being themselves discovered truths, revealed by human reason, by social genius, are equally incomplete and enclose the germ of contradiction. Before Mr. Proudhon, social genius has seen only the antagonistic elements and not the synthetic formula, both simultaneously hidden in absolute reason. Economic relations causing to be realized on earth only these insufficient truths, these incomplete categories, these contradictory notions, are then contradictory in themselves, and present the two sides, of which one is good, the other evil. To find the complete truth, the notion in all its plenitude, the synthetic formula, which will annihilate the contradiction, that is the problem of social genius. That is why still, in the illusion of Mr. Proudhon, the same social genius has been driven from one category to the other without having yet come, with all the battery of its category, to drag from God, for absolute reason, a synthetic formula. Quote, "At first society, social genius, presents a first fact, emits a hypothesis, a true contradiction, of which the antagonistic results unfold themselves in the social economy in the same manner as the consequences would have been deduced in the mind, in such wise that the industrial movement, following in all the deductions of ideas, divides into a double current, the one of useful effects, the other of subversive results. To constitute harmoniously this two-faced principle and solve this contradiction, society develops a second, which will very soon be followed by a third, and such will be the progress of social genius until, having exhausted all its contradictions, I suppose, but that is not proved, that there is a finality to the contradiction in humanity. It returns at a bound upon all its anterior positions, and in a single formula solves all its problems." End quote. Volume 1, page 135. Just as before the antithesis was changed into the antidote, so now the thesis becomes the hypothesis. This change of terms on the part of Mr. Proudhon can no longer astonish us. Human reason, which is nothing less than pure, having only incomplete views, meets at each step fresh problems to solve. Each new thesis, which it discovers in absolute reason, and which is the negation of the first thesis, becomes for it a synthesis, which it naively accepts as the solution of the problem in question. It is thus that this reason strives with ever new contradictions, until finding itself as the end of contradictions, it perceives that all its theses and syntheses are only contradictory hypotheses. In its perplexity, quote, human reason, the social genius, returns at a bound upon all its anterior positions, and in a single formula solves all of its problems. End quote. This unique formula, we may say in passing, constitutes the real discovery of Mr. Proudhon. It is constituted value. Hypotheses are only made in view of some end. The end proposed to itself in the first place by the social genius which speaks by the mouth of Mr. Proudhon was the elimination of that which was evil in each economic category, in order to have only the good. For him good, the supreme good, the true practical end, is equality. And why does the social genius propose equality rather than inequality, fraternity, Catholicism, or any other principle? Because, quote, humanity has realized successively so many particular hypotheses only in view of a superior hypothesis, end quote, which is precisely equality. In other words, because equality is the ideal of Mr. Proudhon. He imagines that the division of labor, credit, the workshop, and all the economic relations that have been invented only for the benefit of equality, and nevertheless they have always finished by turning against her. From the fact that the history and the fiction of Mr. Proudhon contradict each other at every step, he concludes that there is a contradiction. If there is a contradiction, it exists only between his fixed idea and the real movement. Henceforth, the good side of an economic relation is that which affirms equality. The bad side is that which denies it and affirms inequality. Every new category is a hypothesis of the social genius to eliminate the inequality engendered by the preceding hypothesis. To sum up, equality is the primitive intention, the mystic tendency, the providential end that the social genius has constantly before its eyes in turning round and round in the circle of economic contradictions. Providence is also the locomotive which conveys all the economic baggage of Mr. Proudhon better than his pure and heedless reason. He has devoted to Providence a whole chapter which follows that on imposts. Providence, the providential end, that is the fine word with which we are presented today to explain the progress of history. In actual fact, this word explains nothing. It is at most a declamatory form, one manner among others of paraphrasing the facts. It is a fact that the landed proprietors of Scotland obtained a new value by the development of English industry. This industry opened up new markets for wool. In order to produce wool on a large scale, it was necessary to turn arable lands into pasture. To effect this transformation, it was necessary to concentrate various properties. To concentrate these properties, it was necessary to abolish small holdings, drive thousands of tenants from their native land, and put in their place a few herdsmen in charge of millions of sheep. Thus, by successive transformations, landlordism in Scotland has resulted in the men being driven away by sheep. Say now that the providential end of landlordism in Scotland was to cause men to be driven away by sheep, and you have constructed providential history. Certainly, the tendency to equality appertains to our century for the men and the means of anterior centuries with wants, means of production, etc., entirely different, worked providentially for the realization of equality, is to begin by substituting the means and the men of one century for the men and the means of anterior centuries, and to misunderstand the historical movement by which successive generations transform the results acquired from the generations which preceded them. Economists know very well that the same thing which was for one the completed work is for the other only the raw material of further production. Suppose, as Mr. Proudhon does, that the social genius has produced, or rather improvised, the feudal barons, with the providential end in view of transforming the peasants into responsible and equal workmen, and you will have made the substitution of ends and of persons quite worthy of this providence, which in Scotland established landlordism in order to give itself the malign pleasure of substituting sheep for men. But since Mr. Proudhon takes so tender an interest in Providence, we will refer him to The History of Political Economy by Mr. de Villeneuve-Bergevin, who also runs after a providential end. This end is no longer equality, but Catholicism. Seventh and last observation. The economists have a singular manner of proceeding. There are for them only two kinds of institutions, those of art and those of nature. Feudal institutions are artificial institutions. Those of the bourgeoisie are natural institutions. In this they resemble the theologians, who also establish two kinds of religion. Every religion but their own is an invention of men, while their own religion is an emanation from God. In saying that existing conditions, the conditions of the bourgeois production, are natural, the economists give it to be understood that these are the relations in which wealth is created and the productive forces are developed conformably to the laws of nature. Thus these relations are themselves natural laws, independent of the influence of time. They are eternal laws which must always govern society. Thus there has been history, but there is no longer any. There has been history, since there have been feudal institutions, and in these feudal institutions were found conditions of production entirely different to those of bourgeois society, which the economists wish to have accepted as being natural and therefore eternal. Feudalism also had its proletariat, serfdom, which enclosed all the germs of the bourgeoisie. Feudal production also had two antagonistic elements, which were equally designated by the names of good side and bad side of feudalism, without regard being had to the fact that it is always the evil side which finishes by overcoming the good side. It is the bad side that produces the movement which makes history, by constituting the struggle. If at the epoch of the reign of feudalism the economists, enthusiastic over the virtues of chivalry, the delightful harmony between rights and duties, the patriarchal life of the towns, the prosperous state of domestic industry in the country, of the development of industry organized in corporations, guilds, and fellowships, in fine, of all which constitutes the beautiful side of feudalism, had proposed to themselves the problem of eliminating all which cast a shadow upon this lovely picture, serfdom, privilege, anarchy, what would have been the result? All the elements which constituted the struggle would have been annihilated, and the development of the bourgeoisie would have been stifled in the germ. They would have set themselves the absurd problem of eliminating history. When the bourgeoisie had overcome it, it was no longer a question of either the good or the bad side of feudalism. The productive forces which were developed by the bourgeoisie under feudalism had now been acquired by the bourgeoisie itself. All the old economic forms, the civil relations corresponding to them, the political state, which was the official expression of the old civil society, were all broken down. Thus, in order to fairly judge feudal production, it is necessary to consider it as a system of production based on antagonism. It is necessary to show how wealth was produced within this antagonism, how the productive forces were developed at the same time as the antagonism of classes, how one of the classes, the bad side, the inconvenience of society, continued always to grow until the material conditions necessary to its emancipation had arrived at maturity. Is it not sufficient to say that the mode of production, the relations in which the productive forces are developed, are nothing less than eternal laws, but that they correspond to a determined development of men, and of their productive forces, and that any change arising in the productive forces of men necessarily affects a change in their conditions of production? As it is above all important not to be deprived of the fruits of civilization, of acquired productive forces, it is necessary to break the traditional forms in which they have been produced. From the moment this happens, the revolutionary class becomes conservative. The bourgeoisie commences with a proletariat which is itself a remnant of feudal times. In the course of its historical development, the bourgeoisie necessarily develops its antagonistic character, which at its first appearance was found to be more or less distinguished, and existed only in a latent state. In proportion as the bourgeoisie develops, it develops in its bosom a new proletariat, a modern proletariat. It develops a struggle between the proletarian class and the bourgeois class, a struggle which, before it is felt, perceived, appreciated, comprehended, avowed, and loudly proclaimed by the two sides, only manifests itself previously by partial and momentary conflicts, by subversive acts. On the other hand, if all the members of the modern bourgeois have an identity of interest, inasmuch as they form a class opposed by another class, they have also conflicting antagonistic interests, inasmuch as they find themselves opposed by each other. This opposition of interests flows from the economic conditions of the bourgeois life. From day to day it becomes more clear that the relations of production in which the bourgeoisie exists have not a simple character, but a double character, a character of duplicity, that in the same relations in which wealth is produced, poverty is produced also, that in the same relations in which there is a development of productive forces, there is a productive force of repression, that these relations produce bourgeois wealth, that is to say the wealth of the bourgeois class, only in continually annihilating the wealth of integral members of that class and in producing an ever-growing proletariat. The more this antagonistic character comes to light, the more the economists, the scientific representatives of bourgeois production, become excited with their own theories, and different schools are formed. We have the fatalist economists, who in their theory are as indifferent to what they call the inconveniences of bourgeois production as the bourgeois themselves are, in actual practice to the sufferings of the proletarians who assist them to acquire riches. In this fatalist school, there are classicists and romanticists. The classicists, like Adam Smith and Ricardo, represent a bourgeoisie which, still struggling with the relics of feudal society, labors only to purify economic relations from the feudal blemishes, to augment the productive forces, and to give to industry and to commerce a fresh scope. The proletariat participating in this struggle, absorbed in this feverish labor, has only passing, accidental sufferings to endure, and itself regards them as such. Economists like Adam Smith and Ricardo, who are the historians of this epoch, have no other mission than to demonstrate how wealth is acquired in the relations of bourgeois production, to formulate these relations in categories, in laws, and to demonstrate how far these laws, these categories, are, for the production of wealth, superior to the laws and categories of feudal society. Poverty in their eyes is only the pain which accompanies all childbirth, in nature as well as in industry. The Romanticists appertain to our epoch, where the bourgeoisie is in direct antagonism to the proletariat, where poverty is engendered in as great abundance as wealth. The economists, then, pose as satisfied fatalists who, from their lofty position, throw a glance of superb disdain on the active men who manufacture wealth. They copy all the developments given by their predecessors, and the indifference with which those was naivete becomes for these others mere coquetry. Afterwards comes the humanitarian school, which takes to heart the evil side of the existing relations of production. The school seeks, as an acquittal for its conscience, to palliate, however little, existing contrasts. It sincerely deplores the distress of the proletariat, the unrestricted competition between the bourgeoisie themselves. It advises the workers to be sober and industrious, and to have but few children. It recommends the bourgeoisie to put thoughtful earnestness into the work of production. The whole theory of this school rests upon interminable distinctions between theory and practice, between principles and results, between the idea and the application, between the content and the form, between the essence and the reality, between right and fact, between the good and the evil side. The philanthropic school is the humanitarian school perfected. It denies the necessity of antagonism. It would make all men bourgeois. It would realize the theory insofar as it is distinguished from practice and encloses no antagonism. It goes without saying that, in theory, it is easy to make abstraction of the contradictions that are met with each instant in reality. This theory would become, then, idealized reality. The philanthropists thus wish to conserve the categories which express bourgeois relations, without having the antagonism which is inseparable from these relations. They fancy they are seriously combating the bourgeois system, and they are more bourgeois than the others. As the economists are the scientific representatives of the bourgeois class, so the socialists and communists are the theorists of the proletarian class. So long as the proletariat is not sufficiently developed to constitute itself as a class, so long as, in consequence, the struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie has not acquired a political character, and while the productive forces are not sufficiently developed in the bosom of the bourgeoisie itself to allow a perception of the material conditions necessary to the emancipation of the proletariat and the formation of a new society, so long these theorists are only utopians who, to obviate the distress of the oppressed classes, improvise systems and run after a regenerative science. But as history develops, and with it the struggle of the proletariat becomes more clearly defined, they have no longer any need to seek for such a science in their own minds. They have only to give an amount of what passes before their eyes and to make of that their medium. So long as they seek science and only make systems, so long as they are at the beginning of the struggle, they see in poverty only poverty, without seeing therein the revolutionary subversive side which will overturn the old society. From that moment, science, produced by the historical movement and linking itself thereto in full knowledge of the facts of the case, has ceased to be doctrinaire and has become revolutionary. Let us return to Mr. Proudhon. Each economic relation has a good and bad side. That is the single point upon which Mr. Proudhon does not contradict himself. The good side he sees explained by the economists, the bad side he sees denounced by the socialists. He borrows from the economists the necessity of eternal relations. He borrows from the socialists the illusion of seeing in poverty only poverty. He is in agreement with both in wishing to refer it to the authority of science. Science, for him, is reduced to the insignificant proportion of a scientific formula. It is thus that Mr. Proudhon flatters himself to have made the criticism of both political economy and of communism. He is below both the one and the other, below the economists, since as a philosopher who has under his hand a magic formula, he has believed himself able to do without entering into purely economic details, below the socialists, since he has neither sufficient courage nor sufficient intelligence to raise himself, were it only speculatively, above the bourgeois horizon. He wished to be the synthesis, he is the composite error. He wished to soar as man of science above the bourgeoisie and the proletarians. He is only the petty bourgeois, tossed about constantly between capital and labor, between political economy and communism. Chapter 1, Section 2, The Division of Labor and Machinery. The division of labor opens, according to Mr. Proudhon, the series of economic evolutions. The good side of the division of labor, quote, considered in its essence, the division of labor is the mode according to which is realized the equality of conditions and of intelligences. End quote. Volume 1, page 93. The bad side of the division of labor, quote, the division of labor has become for us an instrument of misery. End quote. Volume 1, page 99. Variant. Quote, labor, in dividing itself according to the law which belongs to it, and which is the first condition of its fecundity, tends to the negation of its ends, and destroys itself. End quote. Volume 1, page 94. The problem to solve. To find, quote, the recomposition which will efface the inconveniences of the division of labor while conserving all its useful effects. End quote. Volume 1, page 97. The division of labor is, according to Mr. Proudhon, an eternal law, a simple and abstract category. It is necessary, then, that the abstraction, the idea, the word, should suffice him to explain the division of labor in the different epochs of history. Castes, corporations, the manufacturing regime, the great industry, must be explained by the single word division. First study well the meaning of division, and then you will not need to study the numerous influences which give to the division of labor a definite character in each epoch. Certainly this would be to render things altogether too simple, by merely reducing them to the categories of Mr. Proudhon. History does not proceed so categorically. 3 whole centuries have been necessary in Germany to establish the first great division of labor, that is, the separation of the town from the country. As this single relation, that of town to country, became modified, so the whole society was modified in consequence. To view only this single phase of the division of labor, you have the ancient republics, or Christian feudalism, early England with its barons, or modern England with its cotton lords. In the 14th and 15th centuries, when yet there were no colonies, when America did not yet exist for Europe, when Asia only existed by the intermediary of Constantinople, when the Mediterranean was the center of commercial activity, the division of labor had quite another form, quite another aspect, to that which it had in the 17th century, when the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the English, and the French had colonies established in all parts of the world. The extent of the market and its physiognomy give to the division of labor in the different epochs a physiognomy, a character, which it would be difficult to deduce from the single word division, from the idea, or from the category. Quote, "All the economists," says Mr. Proudhon, "since Adam Smith have designated the advantages and the inconveniences of the law of division, but have insisted very much more on the first than on the second, because that better served their optimism, and without any one of them ever asking himself what could be the inconveniences of a law, how could the same principle, pursued rigorously to its consequences, conduct to effects diametrically opposed? No single economist, either before or since Adam Smith, has done more than perceive that there was a problem to solve. Say only goes so far as to recognize that in the division of labor, the same cause which produces the good engenders the evil." End quote. Adam Smith goes farther than Mr. Proudhon thinks he does. He has clearly seen that, quote, "in reality the difference of natural talents between individuals is much less than is supposed. These dispositions so different, which seem to distinguish the men of different professions, when they arrive at mature age, are not so much the cause as the effect of the division of labor." End quote. In principle, a porter differs less from a philosopher than a mastiff from a greyhound. It is the division of labor which has placed an abyss between the two. All this does not prevent Mr. Proudhon from saying, in another place, that Adam Smith had no doubt of the inconveniences produced by the division of labor. It is still this which makes him say that J.B. Say was the first to recognize, quote, "that in the division of labor the same cause which produces the good engenders the evil." End quote. But let us hear Lamonti, sum suic, quote, "Mr. J.B. Say has done me the honor of adopting in his excellent treatise on political economy the principle which I brought to light in this fragment on the moral influence of the division of labor. The somewhat frivolous title of my book has doubtless precluded him from citing me. I can attribute to no other motive than this the silence of a writer too rich in his own treasures to need to disavow so modest a loan." End quote. Lamonti, Œuvres Complètes, Volume 1, page 245, Paris, 1840. Let us render him this justice. Lamonti has intellectually explained the evil consequences of the division of labor, as it is constituted in our days, and Mr. Proudhon found nothing to add thereto. But since, by the faults of Mr. Proudhon, we are now engaged in this question of priority, we may say in passing that long before Mr. Lamonti, and 17 years before Adam Smith, the pupil of A. Ferguson, the latter clearly explained the subject in a chapter treating specially of the division of labor. Quote, "There will ever be doubts as to whether the general capacity of a nation grows in proportion to the progress of the arts. Many mechanical arts succeed perfectly when they are totally destitute of the assistance of reason or sentiment, and ignorance is the mother of industry as well as of superstition. Reflection and imagination are likely to go astray, but the habit of moving the hand or foot depends upon neither the one or the other. Thus we might say that perfection, as regards manufacture, consists in its being able to be dismissed from the mind, in such a manner that without an effort of the brain the workshop may be operated like a machine, of which the parts are men. The general officer may be very accomplished in the art of war, while all the merit of the soldier is limited to executing certain movements of the foot or hand. The one may have gained what the other has lost. In a period where all is separated, the art of thinking may itself form a separate function." A. Ferguson, Essai sur l'histoire de la société civile, Paris, 1783. To terminate the literary view, we formally deny that, quote, "all the economists have insisted very much more on the advantages than on the inconveniences of the division of labor." End quote. It is sufficient to name Sismondi. Thus, as regards the advantages of the division of labor, Mr. Proudhon had nothing to do but to paraphrase, more or less pompously, the general phrases which everybody knows. Let us now see how he derives from the division of labor, taken as a general law, as a category, a thought, the inconveniences which are attached to it. How is it that this category, this law, implies an unequal distribution of labor to the detriment of the equalitarian system of Mr. Proudhon? Quote, "At this solemn hour of the division of labor, the wind of the tempests begins to beat upon humanity. Progress is not accomplished for all in an equal and uniform manner. It begins by creating a small number of privileged persons. It is this respect of persons on the part of progress which has created the old established belief in the natural and providential inequality of conditions, and has given birth to castes and has hierarchically constituted all societies." End quote. Proudhon, Volume 1, page 97. The division of labor has made castes, but castes are the inconveniences of the division of labor. Then it is the division of labor which has engendered inconveniences. Quod erat demonstradum. Would you go further and ask what causes the division of labor to create castes, hierarchic constitutions, and privileged classes? Mr. Proudhon will tell you, progress. And what has made this progress? The limit. The limit for Mr. Proudhon is the respect of persons on the part of progress. After philosophy comes history. There is no longer either descriptive history or dialectic history. It is comparative history. Mr. Proudhon establishes a comparison between the workman printer of today and the workman printer of the Middle Ages, between the workman of the Creusot ironworks and the country blacksmith, between the man of letters of our days and the man of letters of the Middle Ages, and he makes the balance lean to the side of those who appertain more or less to the division of labor such as the Middle Ages have constituted or transmitted it. He opposes the division of labor of one historical epoch to the division of labor of another historical epoch. Was this what Mr. Proudhon had to demonstrate? No. He ought to have shown us the inconveniences of the division of labor in general, of the division of labor as category. But of what use is it further to dwell upon this part of Mr. Proudhon's work, since a little further on we shall see him formally retract all of these pretended developments himself. Quote, "The first effect of divided labor," continues Mr. Proudhon, "after the degradation of the mind, is the prolongation of the periods of work, which grow in inverse ratio to the amount of intelligence exercised. But as the duration of these periods cannot exceed 16 or 18 hours a day, from the moment when compensation cannot be taken by additional time, it will be affected in the price, and wages will fall. This is certain, and that is all we are concerned to note, that the universal conscience does not put at the same rate the work of an overseer and that of a laborer. There is, then, a necessity for a reduction in the price of the day's work, so that the worker, after having been afflicted in his mind by a degrading function, should not fail to be also stricken in the body by the meagerness of the remuneration." End quote. We will pass over the logical value of these syllogisms, which Kant would call paralogisms, and consider them as they are. Here is their substance. The division of labor reduces the worker to a degrading function. To this degrading function corresponds a depraved mind. With the depravity of the mind goes a constant reduction of wages, and, in order to prove that this reduction of wages is adapted to a depraved mind, Mr. Proudhon says, to absolve his own conscience, that it is the universal conscience which wills it thus. Is the soul of Mr. Proudhon counted in the universal conscience? Machinery is, for Mr. Proudhon, quote, the logical antithesis of the division of labor, and, in support of his dialectic, he begins by transforming machinery into a factory. After having supposed the modern factory in order to have poverty flow from the division of labor, Mr. Proudhon supposes poverty engendered by the division of labor in order to arrive at the factory, and to be able to represent it as the dialectic negation of this poverty. After having stricken the worker morally by a degrading function and physically by the meagerness of his wages, after having put the worker in a position of dependence upon the overseer and reduced his work to the mere manual task of a laborer, he betakes himself again to the factory and to the machines in order to degrade the worker by giving him a master, and he finishes his humiliation by causing him to be reduced from the rank of an artisan to that of a mere laborer. What beautiful dialectic! And yet, if he would only stick to that. But no, he must have a new history of the division of labor, no longer in order to derive contradictions therefrom, but in order to reconstruct the factory after his own fashion. To arrive at this end, he has to forget all that he has just said about this division. Labor is organized and divided variously, according to the instruments which it manipulates. The windmill supposes a division of labor quite other than that of the steam mill. To begin by the division of labor in general in order to arrive at a specific instrument of production, machinery is therefore to fly in the face of history. Machinery is no more an economic category than is the ox which draws the plow. Machinery is only a productive force. The modern workshop, which is based on the application of machinery, is a social relation of production, an economic category. Let us see now how these things pass in the brilliant imagination of Mr. Proudhon. Quote, in society, the incessant apparition of machinery is the antithesis, the inverse formula of labor. It is the protest of industrial genius against fragmentary and homicidal labor. What, in effect, is a machine? A means of reuniting different particles of labor, which division had separated. Every machine might be defined as a summary of many operations. Therefore, through the machine, there would be the restoration of the worker. Machinery standing in political economy, in contradiction to the division of labor, represents the synthesis opposing, in the human mind, the analysis. The division only separates the different parts of labor, leaving each to the specialty most agreeable to him. The factory groups the workers, according to the relation of each part to the whole. It introduces the principle of authority into labor. But that is not all. The machine or the factory, after having degraded the workman by giving him a master, finishes his humiliation by causing him to be reduced from the rank of an artisan to that of a mere laborer. The period through which we are now passing, that of machinery, is distinguished by a special character. It is that of the wage worker. The wage worker is posterior to the division of labor and exchange. End quote. A simple observation to Mr. Proudhon. The separation of the different parts of labor, leaving to each man the faculty of devoting himself to the specialty most agreeable to him, a separation which Mr. Proudhon dates from the beginning of the world, exists only in modern industry, under the regime of competition. Mr. Proudhon afterwards gives us a genealogy, much too interesting, in order to demonstrate how the workshop is born from the division of labor and the wage worker from the workshop. 1. He imagines a man who, quote, has remarked that by dividing production into different parts and causing each to be executed by a separate workman, end quote, the forces of production might be multiplied. 2. This man, seizing the thread of this idea, quote, tells himself that, in forming a permanent group of assorted workmen for the special object that he has in view, he will obtain a more regular and more abundant production, etc. End quote. 3. This man makes a proposition to other men to get them to grasp his idea and the thread of his idea. 4. This man, at the inception of the industry, acts as an equal to equals towards the companions who, later, become his workmen. 5. Quote, he is sensible, in fact, that this primitive equality must rapidly disappear through the advantageous position of the master and the dependence of the wage worker. End quote. That is a further sample of the historical and descriptive method of Mr. Proudhon. Let us now examine, from the historical and economic point of view, and see if really the workshop or the machine has introduced the principle of authority into society subsequent to the division of labor, if it has on one hand rehabilitated the worker, while on the other subjecting him to authority, if the machine is the recomposition of divided labor, the synthesis of labor, opposed to its analysis. Society as a whole has this in common with the interior of a factory, that it also has its division of labor. If the division of labor in a modern factory were taken as a model to be applied to an entire society, the society the best organized for the production of wealth would be incontestably that which had but one single master distributing the work, according to a regulation arranged beforehand, to the various members of the community. But it is not so. While in the interior of the modern factory the division of labor is minutely regulated by the authority of the capitalist, modern society has no other regulation, no other authority to arrange the distribution of labor than free competition. Under the patriarchal regime, under the regime of castes, under the feudal and corporative regime, there was division of labor in the whole of society according to fixed regulations. Were these regulations established by a legislator? No. Originally born of the conditions of material production, it was not till much later that they were established as laws. It was thus that these various forms of the division of labor became to such an extent the basis of social organization. As to the division of labor in the factory, it was very little developed in all these forms of society. It might even be set up as a general rule, that the less authority presides over the division of labor in the interior of society, the more will the division of labor be developed inside the factory, and the more absolutely will it there be subject to the authority of a single individual. Thus the authority in the factory, and that in society, in relation to the division of labor, are in inverse ratio the one to the other. It is now important to see what is this factory, in which the occupations are greatly separated, where the task of each worker is reduced to a very simple operation, and where the authority, capital, groups and directs the laborers. How has this workshop come into existence? To answer this question, we shall have to examine how manufacturing industry, properly so called, has been developed. I refer now to that industry which is not yet modern industry, with its machinery, but which is, at the same time, neither the industry of the artisans of the Middle Ages nor domestic industry. We will not enter into elaborate details. We will only give some summarized points in order to show that history cannot be made with formulas. One of the most indispensable conditions for the formation of the manufacturing industry was the accumulation of capitals facilitated by the discovery of America and the introduction of its precious metals. It has been sufficiently proved that the augmentation of the means of exchange has resulted in, on one side the depreciation of wages and rent, and on the other the increase of industrial profits. In other terms, in proportion as the landlord class and the working class, the feudal lords and the people, fall, so the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, rises. There have been other circumstances which have operated simultaneously with the development of the manufacturing industry. The increase of the commodities put in circulation when commerce penetrated to the East Indies by the way of the Cape of Good Hope, the colonial regime, and the development of maritime commerce. Another point which has not yet been sufficiently appreciated in the history of manufacturing industry was the disbanding of the numerous retainers of the feudal lords, the subaltern members of which became vagabonds before entering the factory. The creation of the factory was preceded by an almost universal vagabondage in the 15th and 16th centuries. The factory found another powerful support in the numerous peasants, who continually driven from the country districts by the transformation of the fields into pasturage, and through the progress of agriculture rendering a smaller number of hands necessary for cultivation, steadily flocked into the towns during whole centuries. The growth of the market, the accumulation of capitals, the modification of the social position of classes, a crowd of people who found themselves deprived of their sources of income. These were the various historical conditions for the formation of the manufacturing industry. It was not, as Mr. Proudhon says, certain amiable stipulations between equals which brought men together in the factory. It was not even in the bosom of the ancient corporations that manufacture had its birth. It was the merchant who became the chief of the modern factory, and not the ancient master of corporations. Almost everywhere, there was a furious struggle between the manufacturing industry and the handicrafts. The accumulation and concentration of instruments of production and of work people preceded the development of the division of labor inside the factory. A manufactory consists very much more in the union of a large number of work people and many trades in a single place, in one apartment, under the control of one capital, than in the analysis of the different operations and the adaptations of each worker to one simple task. The utility of a factory consists much less in the division of labor, properly so called, than in the fact that the work is performed on a much larger scale, that much unproductive expenditure is thereby saved, etc. At the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th centuries, there was scarcely any division of labor in Dutch manufactories. The development of the division of labor presupposes the union of work people in a factory. There is not even a single example, either in the 16th or 17th centuries, of the different branches of the same trade being separately exploited to such a point that it would have sufficed to bring them together in one place to obtain a complete factory. But once the men and the instruments of production were brought together, the division of labor, as it existed under the form of cooperation, was reproduced, was necessarily reflected inside the factory. For Mr. Proudhon, who sees things upside down, if indeed he always sees them, the division of labor, in the sense given to it by Adam Smith, preceded the factory, which was a necessary condition of its existence. Machinery properly so called dates from the end of the 18th century. Nothing could be more absurd than to see in machinery the antithesis of the division of labor, the synthesis giving unity again to divided labor. The machine is a union of the instruments of labor, and not at all a combination of labors for the workman himself. Quote, when, by the division of labor, each separate operation has been reduced to the operation of a simple instrument, the union of all these instruments put in operation by a single motor constitutes a machine. End quote. Babbage. Traité sur l'économie des machines, etc. Paris, 1833. Simple tools, accumulation of tools, composite tools, the putting in motion of a composite tool by a single manual motor, by man, the putting in motion of these instruments by natural forces, the machine, a system of machines with a single motor, a system of machines with an automaton for motor. Such is the development of machinery. The concentration of the instruments of production and the division of labor are as inseparable the one from the other as are, in the domain of politics, the concentration of the public powers and the division of private interests. England, with the concentration of land, the instrument of agricultural industry, has, at the same time, division of agricultural labor and the application of machinery to the exploitation of the soil. France, which has the division of this instrument, the system of small property in land, has, generally speaking, neither division of agricultural labor nor the application of machinery to the cultivation of the soil. For Mr. Proudhon, the concentration of the instruments of labor is the negation of the division of labor. In reality, we find it to be quite the contrary. In proportion as the concentration of these instruments is developed, so also this division is developed, and vice versa. To this is due the fact that every great invention in mechanics is followed by a greater division of labor, and each advance in the division of labor brings in its turn new mechanical inventions. We do not need to recall the fact that the great development of the division of labor began in England after the invention of machinery. Thus the spinners and weavers were, for the most part, peasants, such as we meet them today in the more backward countries. The invention of machines has completely separated the manufacturing from the agricultural industry. The spinner and the weaver, hitherto united in one family, were separated by the machine. Thanks to the machine, the spinner can live in England while the weaver dwells in India. Before the invention of machinery, the industry of a country was exercised principally on the raw material which was the product of its soil. Thus, in England, wool. In Germany, flax. In France, silk and flax. In India and the Levant, cotton, etc. Thanks to the application of machinery, and of steam, the division of labor has been able to assume such dimensions that the great industry, detached from the national soil, depends only upon the markets of the world, on international exchanges, and on an international division of labor. In fine, the machine exercises such an influence on the division of labor that when in the manufacture of any given product means have been found to partially introduce mechanical appliances, the manufacture has been immediately divided into two exploitations entirely independent of each other. Is it necessary to speak of the providential and philanthropic end which Mr. Proudhon discovers in the original invention and application of machinery? When in England the market has become so fully developed that manual labor no longer sufficed to supply it, the need for machinery made itself felt. It was then that the application of mechanical science, which has been fully prepared during the 18th century, was thought of. The organized factory marked its appearance by acts which were nothing short of philanthropic. Children were kept to work by blows of the whip, they were made objects of traffic, and were contracted for with orphanages and workhouses. All the laws on the apprenticeship of workpeople were abolished, because, to make use of the phrases of Mr. Proudhon, synthesized workers were no longer needed. In fine, from 1825 all the new inventions were the result of conflicts between the worker and the capitalist, who sought at all costs to depreciate the specialty of the workman. After each strike, however unimportant, a new machine appeared. The workman was so far from seeing in the machines a kind of rehabilitation, of restoration, as Mr. Proudhon calls it, that in the 18th century he for a long time resisted the nascent empire of the automaton. Quote, Wyatt, says Dr. Urey, invented the series of fluted rollers, the spinning fingers usually ascribed to Arkwright. The main difficulty did not, to my apprehension, lie so much in the invention of a proper self-acting mechanism, as in training human beings to renounce their desultory habits of work, and to identify themselves with the unvarying regularity of the complex automaton. But to devise and administer a successful code of factory discipline suited to the necessities of factory diligence was the Herculean enterprise, the whole achievement of Arkwright. End quote. In short, by the introduction of machinery, the division of labor within society has been developed. The task of the workman within the factory has been simplified. Capital has been accumulated, and man has become further dismembered. If Mr. Proudhon would be an economist, and leave for an instant the evolution in the series of the understanding, he would draw from Adam Smith his knowledge of the time when the automatic factory had scarcely come into existence. In fact, learn the difference between the division of labor as it existed in the time of Adam Smith and as we see it in the automatic factory. In order to make this clearly understood, it will be sufficient to cite some passages from the Philosophy of Manufactures by Dr. Urey. Quote, When Adam Smith wrote his immortal Elements of Economics, automatic machinery being hardly known, he was properly led to regard the division of labor as the grand principle of manufacturing improvement, and he showed, in the example of pin-making, how each handicraftsman, being thereby enabled to perfect himself by practice in one point, became a quicker and cheaper workman. In each branch of manufacture, he saw that some parts were, on that principle, of easy execution, like the cutting of pin wires into uniform lengths, and some were comparatively difficult, like the formation and fixation of their heads. And therefore he concluded that to each workman of appropriate value and cost was naturally assigned. This appropriation forms the very essence of the division of labor. But what was in Dr. Smith's time a topic of useful illustration cannot now be used without risk of misleading the public mind as to the right principle of manufacturing industry. In fact, the division, or rather adaptation of labor to the different talents of men, is little thought of in factory employment. On the contrary, wherever a process requires particular dexterity and steadiness of hand, it is withdrawn as soon as possible from the cunning workman, who is prone to irregularities of many kinds, and it is placed in charge of a peculiar mechanism so self-regulating that a child may superintend it. The principle of the factory system, then, is to substitute mechanical science for hand skill, and the partition of a process into its essential constituents for the division or gradation of labor among artisans. On the handicraft plan, labor more or less skilled was usually the most expensive element of production. But on the automatic plan, skilled labor gets progressively superseded and will, eventually, be replaced by mere overlookers of machines. By the infirmity of human nature, it happens that the more skillful the workman, the more self-willed and intractable he is apt to become, and, of course, the less fit a component of a mechanical system in which by occasional irregularities he may do great damage to the whole. The grand object, therefore, of the modern manufacturer is, through the union of capital and science, to reduce the task of his workpeople to the exercise of vigilance and dexterity, faculties, when concentrated to one process, speedily brought to perfection in the young. Quote, on the gradation system, a man must serve an apprenticeship of many years before his hand and eye become skilled enough for certain mechanical feats. But on the system of decomposing a process into its constituents, and embodying each part in an automatic machine, a person of common care and capacity may be entrusted with any of the said elementary parts after a short probation, and may be transferred from one to another on any emergency at the discretion of the master. Such translations are utterly at variance with the old practice of the division of labor, which fixed one man to shaping the head of a pin, and another to sharpening its point, with most irksome and spirit-wasting uniformity for a whole life. But on the equalization plan of self-acting machines, the operative needs to call his faculties only into agreeable exercise. As his business consists in tending the work of a well-regulated mechanism, he can learn it in a short period, and when he transfers his services from one machine to another, he varies his task, and enlarges his views by thinking on those general combinations which result from his and his companions' labors. Thus, that cramping of the faculties, that narrowing of the mind, that stunting of the frame, which were ascribed, and not unjustly, by moral writers, to the division of labor, cannot, in common circumstances, occur under the equitable distribution of industry. It is, in fact, the constant aim and tendency of every improvement in machinery to supersede human labor altogether, or to diminish its costs, by substituting the industry of women and children for that of men, or that of ordinary laborers for trained artisans. This tendency to employ merely children with watchful eyes and nimble fingers, instead of journeymen of long experience, shows how the scholastic dogma of the division of labor into degrees of skill has been exploded by our enlightened manufacturers. Andrew Urey, Philosophy of Manufactures, 1835, page 15 and 16. That which characterizes the division of labor within modern society is that it engenders specialties, species, and with them that stupefying of handicrafts. Quote, we are struck with admiration, says Lemonti, in seeing among the ancients the same individual being at once, and, in an eminent degree, philosopher, poet, orator, historian, priest, administrator, and general. Our minds are awestrucken at the contemplation of so vast a domain. Each one now plants his hedge and fences himself within his own enclosure. I do not know if by this cutting up the field is extended, but I know very well that man is lessened thereby. The division of labor in the automatic factory is characterized by this, that labor there has lost all specialized character. But from the moment that all special development ceases, the need of universality, the tendency towards an integral development of the individual begins to make itself felt. The automatic factory effaces species and the stupefying of handicraft. Mr. Proudhon, not having so much as comprehended this single revolutionary side of the automatic factory, takes a step backward and proposes to the workman that he should not only make the 12th part of a pin, but the whole 12 parts in succession. The workman would thus arrive at the science and conscience of the pin. Such is the synthetic labor of Mr. Proudhon. No one can deny that to make one movement forward and another backward is equally to make a synthetic movement. To sum up, Mr. Proudhon has not got beyond the ideal of the petty bourgeois, and in order to realize this ideal, he thinks of nothing better than to bring us back to the companion, or, at most, to the master. Workman of the Middle Ages. It suffices, he says somewhere in his book, to have made a masterpiece once in a lifetime, to have felt oneself a man for once. Is not that, in its form as well as in its basis, the masterpiece exacted by the trade guild of the Middle Ages?